Good morning. I'm Scott Silliman, and we are delighted that you've chosen to join with us for this conference on these next 2 days to take stock of the administration's strategies on the war on terrorism. I've got to suggest to you that with all the revelations in the news over the last several months about interrogation tactics, torture memos, military commissions, and the administration's efforts to reauthorize the Patriot Act, that I don't think our conference could be more timely or topical than it is. We really hope that the discourse over the next 2 days in our panels and through our meal speakers this afternoon and this evening will serve to help to inform the public debate, because that is surely our goal, all of us who are involved in organizing this conference, to inform the debate so that many of these complex issues facing our government will reach, hopefully, a reasoned solution in these great times of crisis in what we call the war on terrorism. This is truly an interdisciplinary conference. Besides my center and Chris Schrader's program in public law, we're delighted to have as co-sponsors the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy, Elizabeth Keenan Institute for Ethics, and the Triangle Institute for Security Studies. I want to at this time also acknowledge the very generous financial support of Warren and Faye Wickersham, who are with us this morning, and from Professor Gil Merks, who is Duke University's Vice Provost for International Affairs and Development. Their financial support very much helped to make our conference possible. A few administrative details for you. I guess the most important thing is I need to make sure that you know where the restrooms are. And if you haven't found them already, if you go outside to the main corridor where the registration desk is, if you take a left, there are restrooms to your right and also to your left in that main area. Also, we have two ladies who you probably met at the registration desk. Our Lens staff assistant, Doris Ann Kelly, and Susan McLean, who's helping us from the law school. Their job is to make sure that if there's anything you need over these next 2 days, that we will try to provide that for you. So if you have any problems, any issues, transportation issues, hotel issues, or anything like that, please see one of those two young ladies, and we'll try to take care of it. We've tried to structure our conference to leave more than enough time at the end of each panel for questions and answers. It has been our experience that some of the best learning and the best dialogue takes place not so much from the panel speakers, not to take anything away from them, but in the interchange with you as our conferees. So we have tried to leave approximately 25 to 30 minutes at the end of every panel. Each panel is an hour and 45 minutes to allow for that. Now, when we get to the question and answer period for each panel, we have two wireless mics. And we will have two ladies who will be manning those mics. What we would like you to do is please raise your hand and wait for the microphone for a couple of reasons. One, so that everyone else can hear your question, but also we are making a video and audio recording transcript of the entire conference, and we want to make sure that we preserve it. So if you have a question or comment, please raise your hand, wait for someone to bring you the mic, identify yourself, and then fire away. We also have out at the conference table a evaluation form. Those of us who have been doing these conferences for the last several years, Chris, Elizabeth, Peter Fever, Bruce Jellinson, and I, have tried to strive to make each year's better, not only more informative, but to bring a better conference to you. Please tell us on those evaluation forms how we can make these conferences better. We do read them, and we do take it very seriously. This conference is an open conference. I will tell you right now that the members of the press and the media will be here from all three spectrums. We have the print media represented here. I know Frank Davies from Knight Ridder is sitting back there. Tony Losi, USA Today, one of our speakers, is here. Shortly arriving, I think Jackie Northam from NPR will be down to cover the entire conference. And we will have, at the very least this afternoon for the luncheon program, a television camera crew filming Jim Pavitt and perhaps other types or other sessions of the conference. So be aware that everything you say is on the public record and will be recorded and probably printed in tomorrow's newspaper. Lastly, we have over 40 students enrolled, and they will be attending these sessions at different times, some of them for the entire conference. Many of us, when we went to undergraduate or graduate school, I don't think had the opportunity to attend conferences like this, certainly not to meet the very high caliber of speakers that we have at this conference. And many of you are very high-profile personalities. I would ask that as you interact with the students, either at the meals or during the during the panel sessions or during the breaks, that you take the opportunity to get to know them and let them to get to know you. It's been my experience in the past that the students going to our schools today benefit greatly, not only from attending these sessions, but also meeting folks such as you who come to them. So I would encourage you to interact with our students, let them know who you are, and enjoy their interaction. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague and co-sponsor, Chris Schrader. Chris?
Thanks, Scott. My assignment's a simple one, simply to add my welcome on behalf of the Public Law Program to the one that Scott has already given you, and to say just a word about the Public Law Program at Duke Law School. Our function, as we define it, is, broadly speaking, educational, both inside the law school and outside. We do a lot of programming that attempts to bring greater awareness of public law issues to our students. We define public law broadly to include constitutional issues as well as other laws that govern the behavior of elected and public officials, obviously including the civil justice system, separation of powers issues, and other laws that may affect the way our government treats our citizens. It's a broad portfolio, and post 9/11, a lot of our programming has been devoted to issues that have arisen in the war on terror. This is our fourth event this year, conference, that we've sponsored or co-sponsored having to do with some aspects of the war on terror. We're actually holding a fifth conference just as you people are exiting on starting Friday afternoon on reforming the Supreme Court. So if you would like to stay around and help us solve that problem as well, I'd appreciate your assistance. We consider what we're doing both important inside the law school and outside. Inside the law school, we're trying to expose our students to the importance of understanding public law issues and to bring the best possible analysis to them for their education and appreciation. We're also trying to expose to them the idea that public lawyering is something that they might consider as part of their career, whether exclusively becoming career lawyers or as a part of a career that includes other endeavors as well. I've had the privilege of serving in government a couple of times myself. Scott, of course, and other various members of our faculty have had that privilege. But nothing works better than to have folks who are currently engaged in the important work of the country to take the time and come down and talk with our students and to allow students to see the kind of intelligence and concern and dedication that people like the folks we have here, both as panelists and in the audience, bring to their endeavors. So I would also, in closing, reiterate Scott's request that as students come and go to this event, that you'd extend some time and consideration to them and let them have your ear and your voice for a while if they come up to you and ask you to speak with them. We prefer to hold these events in the law school because of that mathematical principle that the attendance of students at events varies inversely with the distance that the event is from where they happen to be at the moment. But this is too large a group for us to be able to hold at the law school at a time we're also teaching classes over Thursday and Friday. But we will get a number of people coming in and out through the day. And I would, as I say, reiterate Scott's request that you give them a moment of your time if you can. So without further ado, welcome to everyone, and I will turn the discussion over to Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, and good morning, and welcome to all of you. All of us at the Keenan Institute for Ethics are delighted and honored to be a part of this conference. It's a real pleasure to collaborate with Scott Silliman on this project. And Duke is unusual in the breadth of its efforts in attending to ethical questions across schools and across disciplines. And so it's always a pleasure to see how, whether it's genomics or whether it's national security, that we are paying attention to the ethical dimensions of these very important questions. And it's also really a privilege to moderate our beginning panel on defining and understanding the causes of terrorism. In the immediate aftermath, in the shock and grief following September 11th, some Americans I know felt that efforts to attend to root causes of terrorism, to ask questions about why is this happening, why do they hate us, that those questions were somehow ethically inappropriate, that they were pointing a finger of accusation at us when after all we were the victims. And yet I think that in the complexities that we have seen in the years since September 11th of the war on terrorism, the war in Iraq, it has become ever clearer that for reasons both ethical and prudential, it is absolutely essential for us to have an understanding of the causes of terrorism. What is it that politically, economically, religiously, socially, psychologically, ethically drives people to take up these tactics and to act in these ways? So we're really privileged today to have three leading experts with us to talk about defining and understanding the causes of terrorism. I need to tell you, if you've looked at your program, that we were to have a fourth panelist, Mamoun Fandy of Fandy Associates, who unfortunately had to have emergency oral surgery yesterday. So he's not going to be with us, but we do have three wonderful panelists, and let me introduce them in the order in which they will speak. We will hear first from Professor Charles Kurzman, who is Associate Professor of Sociology and Associate Director of the Carolina Center for the Study of the Middle East and Muslim Civilizations at our sister friend institution, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is the author of several very interesting books, most recently The Unthinkable Revolution in Iran, as well as editor of An Islamic Reformation, Modernist Islam, 1840 to 1940, and Liberal Islam, a source book. And he's working now on a project on democratic experiments in multiple parts of the world, including the Middle East, in the early part of the 20th century, and comparing them to contemporary efforts at democratization. He will be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Professor Mohammed Hafez, who is a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He is the author of a book entitled Why Muslims Rebel, Repression and Resistance in the Islamic World, and teaches courses on Islam and world politics, politics of the Middle East, and terrorism and political violence. Currently, he's been working on a project funded by the United States Institute of Peace that looks specifically at suicide bombers in the Palestinian-Israeli struggle since 2000, and he will be sharing parts of that work with us in his remarks at this conference. And then finally, my dear friend and Duke colleague, Professor Ebrahim Moosa, who is an associate research professor in the Department of Religion and co-director here at Duke of the Center for the Study of Muslim Networks. He has had a very interesting career. He has worked not only as an academic, but was a journalist in the UK for Arabia, the Islamic World Review, and later a staff writer at MEAD, the Middle East Economic Digest. He's working on a book currently entitled A Poetics of Imagination, Ghazali and the Construction of Muslim Thought, that explores the work of a great medieval Muslim thinker, but has also published on a wide range of topics, including ethics and law, human rights, women's rights, and Muslim family law. So please join me in welcoming our panel, and we'll begin with Professor Charles Kurzman.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and I'm honored to join you all and to kick off this conference, a very important set of topics. My brief today is to review for you, introduce literature on social science explanations for terrorist activities, and perhaps to link that to some of the issues that will be under discussion in the following panels. I'd like to try to do this by breaking down the categories of social scientific explanations in the literature on terrorist activities into 5 groups of explanations that I'm going to label cultural, economic, political, technological, and then rational choice. And I'll give a brief summary within each. Then I'm going to turn to what I think are some of the challenges facing these explanations in future social scientific work, and whether there may be possibly a mismatch between the demands being placed on social scientific research in the war against terrorism and the ability of social science to meet those demands. So to begin with, social scientific explanations. I'm going to focus in literature primarily on Islamic terrorism, not because Islamic terrorism is numerically the most common, which it is not, but rather because the current war on terrorism seems to be geared primarily towards terrorist acts by Muslims. And we've seen less policy shift in the wars against terror in Colombia, in Sri Lanka, and elsewhere. So it seems to me that if we're talking about new activities, new policies, new programs, it tends to be focused on Islamic terrorism. Let me start then with the cultural explanations. These explanations, some of them talk about the long-term cultural factors that might be affecting the rise of terrorist activities. For example, Islamic traditions that date back a millennium or more. Traditions that have to do with subsuming individual worth, individual value to the group, with submission to God, and the idea that one's own faith is tied not to one's own actions, but rather to some divine will, and that submission to this divine will is a sign of one's elect status as one of the elect, and that this Islamic faith and Islamic tradition can be witnessed as far back as a millennium ago and as recently as this year. That there are commonalities across this tradition, and that the tradition shapes much of the behavior of many Muslims today. And you can point to different aspects of that tradition, and people do point to different aspects, but in general it has to do with the submerging of individual goals into group goals and divine goals. Part of this then is the culture of martyrdom that people have talked about, that specifically it inverts the rational choice idea that we are all trying to survive and get ahead in this world, and suggests that rather for many Muslims the way to get ahead in the world is to seek martyrdom in the just cause of just war, and therefore seek eternal benefits that outweigh anything that one could achieve in this world. This culture of martyrdom is said to produce then a large number of Muslims who are willing to give their lives for the cause. The question then becomes, how do they get mobilized and trained so as to do maximum damage? A third social scientific explanation has to do with humiliation and the history of colonialism and of the rise of the West and the decline of Islamic power in the world. This is the explanation favored by Bernard Lewis, Princeton, who is, of course, the single most famous and widely known and influential Middle East scholar working today. At the same time, those of us who study the modern world are not satisfied with his empirical explorations, with his research on the modern era. I would like to know, for example, what kind of data we can present about humiliation, about these feelings of inferiority about, and how they may lead to violence. In fact, all three of these streams within the cultural category suffer from a lack of evidence. That is, how does the Islamic tradition affect people's day-to-day lives in a way that would careen them off of the normal paths of their everyday existence and send them into training camps and into terrorist activities. The second category also suffers from a lack of evidence, but it still seems to be a very popular explanation, and that is economic explanations for the rise of terrorism. So you see people saying, well, if we can cure poverty, and if we could perhaps make a dent in inequality in Muslim societies, then we'll be able to shrink the available pool of potential suicide bombers, terrorists in those societies. The difficulty with these explanations is that the suicide bombers tend not to be poor, desperately poor people. They're not the shantytown dwellers, recent urban migrants from the countryside in Muslim societies. They tend to be relatively well-educated and solid middle-class folks, and there have been a couple studies that have documented that. And these countries are not the most unequal countries either. That, of course, there's problems of inequality in Saudi Arabia, as everywhere, but it's by no means the most unequal society in the world. We would expect to see far more terrorist activity if inequality were the key factor in many other societies. Thank you. The third set of categories is a little harder to test empirically, but the idea is that these political explanations have to do either with the role of the power of the state, that is the structure of government, in various Muslim societies, or in another such stream of political explanations has to do with international relations and the declining role of superpowers in shaping world politics. With the issue of repression and the state's role in either generating or suppressing violent protest, including terrorist activities, my colleague Mohammed Hafez has written an extremely interesting book called Why Muslims Rebel that deals with the issue of repression and the double-edged sword that repression can be. Extremely repressive states are both the most able to infiltrate and suppress violent protesters, opposition of any sort, and the most vulnerable to the outbreak of violent protest. And this double-edged sword suggests that there is a very tricky interaction going on, or that perhaps repression and the lack of democratic institutions for participation are not the most important factors. And sorting that out is a very difficult thing. With international relations, the idea that we no longer live in a Cold War period when most of world politics is sort of magnetically drawn to the two poles. Now, in a unipolar world, politics no longer has this, world politics, international relations no longer have this organizing principle. And so we are now seeing far more swings around a pole where the United States stands as the major actor, and then everybody else swirling around and swarming in various different ways. That there's something new about the current era, and that this something new has provided an opening for all sorts of radical challenges to the world order, including Islamic challenges. A fourth set of categories has to do with the rise of technology. In a way, this is opposite to the economic arguments that say it's poverty and backwardness and lack of integration into the world economy and failures at globalization, the Thomas Friedman type argument, that have generated so much radical activity. Friedman focuses, for example, in his work on madrasas, religious Islamic seminaries, and the role that they play in generating Islamic radicalism, and says, well, these people have not joined the modern world. They don't have their Lexus yet. They're still with the olive tree. The problem with these arguments is that very few terrorists actually come from these seminaries. The Taliban did, but the Taliban are not global terrorists. They were territorially based. we should make a distinction between your territorially based, often neo-traditional movements that may share some goals with the global jihadis, the global terrorist threat, but do not share a social basis, and often their alliances are very much in tension or non-existent. So the Taliban were from the madrasas, but Al-Qaeda is not. Al-Qaeda folks are modern educated. They come from families that were able to send them to for technological training, scientific training. You find engineers, doctors, modern educated folks who speak European languages, have traveled to Europe and elsewhere. They're global citizens. And one of the things that they have imbibed is the ability to use modern technology. Al-Qaeda, of course, is famous for its reliance on the internet, for spreading information, for communications. At least until recently, there was apparently quite a bit of use of cell phones, satellite phones, and all sorts of high technology. Now, that doesn't mean that the traditionalists are not also willing to use this technology when it's appropriate, when they feel it's appropriate for them. But let me make a stark distinction. Mullah Muhammad Omar, the leader of the Taliban, never had his photograph taken, at least willingly. Whereas Osama bin Laden, leader of Al-Qaeda, was famous for making videotapes of himself and sending them to satellite television stations. This distinction between the use of modern technologies and the abhorrence of them is a very sharp one between those two groups. Modern technologies includes, of course, taking flight training, pilot training, using world media against itself, a willingness to perhaps search for weapons of mass destruction and try to gain use of them. In other words, these people are relatively tech savvy and willing to use those skills to advance their movement. The final category of social scientific explanations tries to erase almost all of these large-scale forces and focus on individual choices. The rational choice school, which is predominant in economics and political science these days, argues that people are making rational decisions, cost-benefit analyses, even in matters such as political contestations, even in matters such as the choice the decision whether to martyr oneself, to kill oneself in the pursuit of one's goal. And these are difficult things the models to test empirically, not just because we don't have access to the martyrs to interview them and get the kind of information we'd like to get about their psyche, their decision-making processes. This interview data is very difficult to come up with, and by the nature of things, you can almost only get them before they've done it, and not right before. There are some failed martyrs, folks who've tried to carry out suicide attacks, who've been interviewed. It's difficult to say. The second level of difficulty is what would count as confirmation of a rational choice hypothesis. It's more an assumption, really, that what would happen, what kind of analysis would we come up with if we assume that people are making cost-benefit calculations? And the answer to that is, well, some things are worth more than life itself. But in effect, it becomes a post hoc type of explanation. So we have then, as I see it, these 5 general categories of social scientific explanation. You notice I've left out ideology. Ideology as an explanation is not particularly in favor these days. The idea that, well, there is a movement going on to found an Islamic state, perhaps a pan-Muslim Islamic state. The ideology leads people to become radicalized, to see this goal as worth any means whatsoever, by any means necessary. And that the ideology then is how we would explain the emergence of movements. This kind of explanation was much more common several decades ago. You don't see much of that these days. In fact, there's a tendency to downplay the goals of the movement as being unimportant. So what does bin Laden want is seen both as unimportant in a sort of explanatory sense, but also unethical, as Professor Kiss mentioned. That it's irrelevant. We should not take seriously the fact that they may state that they have goals. Okay, let me turn around the question then. all of these explanations are trying to explain why we see so many Islamic terrorists and why now. But let me turn it around and say, why are there so few Islamic terrorists? If there's 1 billion Muslims, give or take a few hundred million, why aren't we seeing terrorist attacks every day, everywhere? How is it that these grand causes, political, economic, cultural, etc., technological, are generating such a tiny trickle of outcomes of people willing to join these movements, give over their lives, if not in martyrdom attacks, then in sort of the way that involvement in a radical movement swallows up your whole life, even if you stay living. You have to give up your normal family routines. Often you have to leave your family and go live on the lam, secret identities, and so on. Why are we seeing so few people willing to do that? I think when we turn it around this way, it raises a different set of questions. Not the push towards Islamic radicalism, but rather the factors that are inhibiting Islamic radicalism. I'd like to mention 5 of these, quickly, of course, and suggest that these are not, most of them, specific to Islamic radicalism, but they're barriers that all movements face when they try to gain adherents and activists. The first I would call the apolitics of survival. Most people are so busy struggling to support themselves and support their families, they just don't have time to waste on political activism. And that these things are important, supporting oneself and supporting one's family. The daily scrounge for income and food, shelter. These things are more important than abstract goals, such as setting up an Islamic state. They're more important than eternal salvation. The people will do things they know are unethical, illegal, immoral, fattening, etc. if they think these activities will help them get by the next day, the next week, the next month. There's a large literature in the sociology and political science of social movements suggesting that most poor people do not participate in movements, even movements that are, one would imagine they would be most interested in joining, the ones that are most directly favorable to them with longer term, medium to long term outcomes that would be most beneficial to them. Poor folks seem to be the last to rally around poor people's movements. The second is prudence. Most people are not willing to face the risk of punishment, the risk of imprisonment, the risk of torture, execution, of losing their lives. And this is true of Muslims as of non-Muslims. There are plenty of examples of non-Muslims, Americans of various faiths, willing to give their lives for their country. I regret that I have but one life to live for my country, said Nathan Hale, I think. The fact that we know this phrase, even if I'm not so certain of the author of the phrase, suggests that this is a common thread in American political consciousness, and that it's seen in a positive way. That giving one's life for one's country is seen as a noble thing, not an idiotic thing, not as a fanatic thing. And yet relatively small portions of Americans are actually willing to do that, just as tiny portions of Muslims are willing to give their lives for their cause. A third category would be free riding. This builds on the rational choice models. The free rider problem, made famous by Mancur Olson in the 1960s, The Logic of Collective Action, his famous book, and then has spurred a whole field of public choice studies, suggesting that people would rather not participate, not invest in the costs of participation, not spend the capital necessary to participate if they can benefit anyway by having others do the dirty work. So if I can drive my gas guzzler and pollute the air and let everybody else drive unsafe cars and not pollute the air and spend extra on unleaded gasoline, it's in my interest to have cleaner air for them doing the hard work than for me to bother myself. free riding is a huge problem for social scientific explanations. It suggests that people will never get involved. If they're rational, they'll never get involved. Now, of course, people do sometimes get involved, and so there have been all sorts of other models that say that when more other people are getting involved, I'm more likely to join, such as critical mass models. In any case, this is potentially one barrier. There's not a whole lot of evidence for people free riding. It's hard to come up with evidence for it. People saying, oh yeah, I'd like to have that outcome, but I'm too lazy or cynical to lift my pinky to help, and so I'll let others do the dirty work. People don't often admit that in interviews or on surveys, and so it's difficult to come up with evidence. Nonetheless, when we do have evidence, the evidence seems to be on the side of critical mass models. That is, when more people are joining, hey, I'm going to go join too. And they do. Brings me to theory number 4, it's contact theory from sociology. Suggests that few people, if you don't have contact with the members of a particular group, you're unlikely to be able to find your way into joining the group. This comes from theories of racial segregation within sociology, but it may be applicable here. The fact is it's difficult to find. There's so few Islamic radicals that it's difficult to find them if you wanted to. So we have the story of the would-be Taliban or Al-Qaeda activists from Oregon who are making their way to the camps in Afghanistan for training prior to 9/11. Maybe it was just after 9/11, I'm forgetting now. In any case, they went for some reason through China. They must have gotten good airfares, or maybe they didn't look at a map. And went then through Pakistan and were trying to make their way into Afghanistan when they ran out of money and wired home, and were then picked up by the police and sent back to the US and faced trial. And suggesting that it's actually not an easy thing to join Al-Qaeda. Even if you wanted to, you may not know how to do it. On the other hand, you have a comment by somebody from the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, who said that in light of the investigations of Islamic charities for supporting terrorism, that every Muslim in the world, every Muslim in the world is 2 degrees of separation away from a terrorist, which, whether or not it was accurate, is probably not helpful for their public relations cause, is suggesting that one could make one's way through these degrees of separation to find activists, to radicals to hook up with. But I'm not sure that that's true in the sense that one could make that these links are traversable. I'm going to add a 5th reason why there are so few Islamic terrorists, and that is what I call radical chic, S-H-E-I-K. Have a good pun, we'll travel. Radical chic and the missing martyrs. Why is it, one of the reasons there may be so few people joining radical movements is they don't actually want them to succeed, even when they say that they support bin Laden or they want to see Sharia law implemented. There's a fair amount of survey evidence to support this. If you ask Muslims in a variety of countries, do you want to see Sharia law implemented? In some countries, you get up to 2/3 of the population saying yes, including countries such as Pakistan and Indonesia, where Islamic parties are contesting elections. If you compare election results with these survey results, you find that they're receiving less than 1/3, often much less than 1/3, of this level of support in the actual votes. And then far fewer numbers are willing to engage in extra-parliamentary, extra-democratic forms of support for these radical movements seeking to implement Sharia law. So what I'm suggesting is that it is cool, it is fashionable among some young people to say that they trust bin Laden to do the right thing regarding world affairs, as a series of surveys by the Pew Foundation asked, but that they don't really want bin Laden to rule over them. And one iconic example of this is the bin Laden t-shirt, which is a self-defeating statement. You wear the bin Laden t-shirt, and what you're saying is, go bin Laden, but what the t-shirt is saying is, I don't mind having graven images on my clothing And I'm willing to wear a Western form of dress that would probably be banned under Islamic regimes if bin Laden were actually to come to power. So it's sort of like college kids wearing Che Guevara imagery. They don't actually want socialist revolution. You know, they don't actually want to give up their own privileges. However, it's a statement that one is against the man, that one is fighting the system. It's a sign of radicalism that has no consequences, because you can rest assured that Che Guevara will not come back from the grave, or his followers come back from the political grave and actually take over your society. I would say there's a similar phenomenon going on with African American Christians who wear Malcolm X gear, despite all that Malcolm X said about Christianity being a slave owner's religion. One of the conclusions I draw from this, if I'm right, is that the prospect of Islamic radicals coming to power in a given society should scare these fair weather friends off of this position and into other political positions. That if you were to democratize and Islamic radicalism actually might have a chance at coming to power, that this level of chic support for the radicals would quickly dry up. Finally, I want to say that social science and these explanations are not particularly well suited for the demands of fighting terrorism. There have been a series of attempts by government officials, escalating since 9/11, to draw on the resources of social science, to enlist social scientists in the war against terror. There was the Policy Awareness Network, the attempt to start an online bidding system about events in the Middle East that was shut down as soon as, even before it was operational, as soon as some senators heard about it and held a press conference denouncing it, that would have allowed experts on the region to bet, and it was unclear whether it was real money or funny money, on whether a terrorist attack would occur in a certain place, whether an invasion would occur in a certain place, regime change, and so other things. They're very sophisticated models that made it look more like a Wall Street derivatives market than anything that social scientists would be used to. But I was kind of looking forward to the idea of betting on this, putting money where my social scientific mouth is. In any case, it was shut down. And it's unclear whether social scientists, what they would have brought to that. I mean, would we have been most successful? Social scientists are remarkably unsuccessful in predicting the outbreak of widespread protest. Social scientists missed the Iranian Revolution. They missed the fall of communism. We got wrong what would happen, the reaction among Muslims to the US-led invasion of Afghanistan. A huge number of us were saying in Islamic studies that if the US invades a Muslim-majority country in this day and age, it will be broadcast live throughout the world. Muslims will be incredibly irate. They will take to the streets, and anti-American sentiment will skyrocket, as well as violence against the US. It's a bad move strategically. Well, we were wrong. The anti-American sentiment couldn't get any higher than it already was in terms of survey results. In terms of people joining radical activist groups, that did not spike. There was relatively little street protest. So most of us were chastened, and before the war on Iraq, it was not Islamic studies specialists saying, you're going to get another huge spike because the first one hadn't occurred. It was more anti-war activists who were not specialists on Islam, who had sat out, by and large, the discussions prior to the US invasion of Afghanistan, and who mobilized with ads like bin Laden in an Uncle Sam suit saying, I want you to invade Iraq, because supposedly we do great things for Al-Qaeda. Department of Homeland Security, thank you. Department of Homeland Security issued a large request for grant proposals last year, seeking for a center of excellence to be founded, a network of universities that would work on how to predict terror, how to prevent it, and then how to respond to it. That grant went to a consortium led by the University of Maryland. The Office of Science and Technology in the Office of the President of the United States has issued a report a couple months ago suggesting, once again, that social science needs to be enlisted in the prediction and prevention of terrorist activities, as well as responses to terrorism. I'd like to suggest is that social science is not very good at prediction in general when it comes to non-routine behaviors. This was a point I tried to make in my book on the unthinkable revolution in Iran, that the fact that the CIA, that social scientists, experts on Iran missed the revolution by and large, didn't see it coming, is not because they were bad social scientists or bad predictors. It's because activities that fall outside of routine behavior are themselves inherently unpredictable. And that the smaller numbers you're trying to predict, and if it's 19 individuals, it's extremely, it's inherently impossible to figure out. So you have, and the reason for this is that people don't know themselves what they're going to do. That they're unable to predict their own behaviors given certain circumstances. If so-and-so goes along, will you do it too? In a revolution, what would you do? If there's 1 million people in the streets, what would you do? None of us know this. Perhaps some people have exit plans. Bigwigs may have exit plans. Perhaps the radicals have some sort of contingency plan for if their fondest dreams come true. But most of us, we can't even put ourselves in that position. What would it really mean? And so what we see empirically from the Iranian Revolution, and others have showed this with other cases, is that preferences change in these high-torque moments of deinstitutionalization when the normal routines of behavior jump from the tracks. That we are unable to not only figure out what we will do, but what we want changes in these moments. And I think that this is happening with Islamic radicalism as well these days. That you have people who couldn't conceive of giving their own lives in a suicide attack, suddenly, in the pressure of the moment, saying, yeah, I'm going to do it, and sticking to that conviction with heavy social pressure from a small group. Figuring that out is short of the investigative type of infiltration, police work, and intelligence work that we are not permitted to do because of our human subjects protections in social science, that we're not going to be that useful and that helpful. So I'm writing myself out of a huge number of grants, perhaps, with these public statements. But I'm trying to be honest about what I see are the limitations and the mismatch, perhaps, between intelligence and policy needs on the one hand, and social science methods and theories on the other. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kurzman. Next, we'll hear from Professor Mohammed Hafez.
I'm going to try to explain suicide bombs in light of that depressing note. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for the great opportunity to address a distinguished audience, so I really appreciate that. And secondly, let me apologize in advance. I have a bit of a cough. The weather suddenly turned nice in Kansas, and we don't know how to deal with it. I'm glad one person laughed. My research deals with the phenomena of suicide bombings, which has been on the rise. Many of us became aware of it after or on the day of September 11th, but actually since the 1980s, suicide bombings in the contemporary period have been on the rise. Now, we've seen this mainly in the Muslim world, but I think it would be a mistake to just equate that, or more recently we've seen it in the Muslim world, but I think it would be a mistake to equate the phenomena of suicide bombings with Islam and Muslims alone. One of the main groups to engage in suicide bombings for a long time has been the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers, or their subdivision of Black Tigers. And we've seen suicide bombings certainly with the kamikazes. We've seen them in the PKK, a Marxist group in Turkey, and more recently in Chechnya, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, obviously Iraq. And Iraq, I think, is becoming quickly with the rate of suicide bombings, they could quickly supersede all the previously mentioned groups. But what I want to focus on today is the case of the Palestinians. In the case of the Palestinians, we see three things that lead me to ask three questions. First, we see tremendous amount of volunteerism on the part of people. This isn't the case of organizations digging and trying to find people to manipulate and recruit and indoctrinate to send out for suicide missions. No, we are getting people that are volunteering for this. And if we believe the statements of the organizers of suicide bombings, there are more volunteers than there are suicide belts. The second question is that we see that this phenomena is deployed not just by religious groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but more recently by secular groups like Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is a kind of a splinter group, or some question whether it's a splinter or not, but it is a group that derives from Fatah, which was the organization led by Yasser Arafat and now by Mahmoud Abbas. So it is the dominant organization in the Palestinian context, and it is known as a nationalist, secularist one, not an Islamist. And certainly there are some Marxist groups, or semi-Marxist, like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and others. The third thing that we notice about this is that suicide bombings have received tremendous amount of support from society. So this isn't a phenomena where you have a bunch of weirdos doing this and society condemning it. On the contrary, you have tremendous amount of veneration taking place. If you go to the West Bank and Gaza, you will not walk down an alley or a street without posters, sometimes overlapping each other, of the various martyrs, martyrs between quotation marks. And so there's tremendous amount of support for this. And this obviously is not just what's out on the walls, but in public opinion polls, et cetera. So these observations lead me to ask three questions. First, how could human beings strap explosives to their bodies, walk into crowded public places, and blow themselves up with the intent of killing others? The instinct for self-preservation is quite strong, and so to do so willingly is an interesting social scientific question. Maybe we can't answer it, but at least we should try to ask it. Secondly, is what motivates organizations to organize and send suicide bombers? So we know, or at least there are volunteers, but what makes organizations want to do this action? And thirdly, why do societies venerate suicide bombers? And by the way, I'm focusing on the Palestinian case, but we know in the case of bin Laden and others that there are a tremendous amount of public support, or at least sentiment in favor of his defiance and war on America, and the attacks of September 11th may not have been celebrated as much, but certainly not many people are willing to condemn them outright. So there does appear to be a wide support for this sort of action. Now, what I argue is that each of these questions constitutes a level of analysis, an individual level, organizational, and societal. And if we try to find one overarching motivation to explain at the three levels of analysis, we will fail. What motivates individuals is different than what motivates organizations, and what motivates organizations and individuals is different from what motivates societies. And this is really what I'm researching. I have an article that's going to be coming out soon in the journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism that is titled in a sort of a verbose scientific language, a social scientific language, Rationality, Culture, and Structure in the Making of Suicide Bombers. But it really reflects the three levels of analysis. And this report is going to be published also by the United States Institute of Peace in a kind of less academic jargon. But in any case, what I argue is that what motivates individuals has to deal with what I call the logic of redemption. And here, it's not so much that I'm trying to explain why individuals do this, but more so to try to understand what is the meaning of martyrdom for people in that context. So it is more of in the Weberian sense of understanding than it is of the social scientific sense of explaining. But nonetheless, it does give us insights on possible root causes. And what motivates organizations, I argue, is purely strategic. That is, it is a tactic that is effective compared to conventional attacks. And so despite the religious rhetoric, despite the culture of martyrdom that sort of is spawned around this phenomenon of suicide bombings, when you probe the statements of the organizers of suicide attacks, you will see that the number one reason why they do it is they see it as being effective against powerful enemies. Or in the lingo of warfare, it is a tactic, an asset in asymmetrical warfare. Now, what motivates societies is also different. At the societal level, we have to look at social conflicts and legitimating authorities. That is, we cannot just simply say, that society is just taken by this culture of martyrdom. The culture of martyrdom is itself underpinned by a polarizing social conflict where people feel disempowered and they are seeking means to become powerful. And the suicide bomber indeed represents a powerful message. And the fact that you have legitimating authorities, both legal or state authorities and religious authorities saying that this is okay is what explains at the societal level. So this is kind of the overview, and now I want to get into a little bit of the details. For the sake of time, what I'm going to do today is just focus on the individual level and the organizational level, and actually I'm going to start with the organizational because I think that's the most important. And I'll leave the societal level aside, and you can ask me questions about it if you want. At the organizational level, we know from the statements of organizers of suicide bombings, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, is that the main reason that they adopted this tactic is because when they are confronted with a powerful Israeli army that is better trained, has Apache helicopters, well-fortified positions, that to use conventional attacks against them, you would fail. So what they would do, and interesting, I heard this on Al Jazeera by Mohammed, who was one of the spokesmen of Hamas in their outside or their bureau abroad. He was talking on Al Jazeera defending the strategy of martyrdom, and he said, look, when we were attacking Israelis in the first 6 months of the uprising, that is between September 2000 and say February, March of 2001, when we were attacking them through conventional means, that is a person carrying a gun, firing at a post, or trying to infiltrate a settlement or something, it would take about 12 Palestinian deaths to kill one Israeli. So the ratio is 12-1 in favor of the Israelis. But when you employ suicide bombings inside Israel, on buses, cafes, in restaurants, in hotels, etc., it took one Palestinian to kill on average 9 Israelis. Now this ratio has changed and is a fluid ratio, but nonetheless, what he points out is that when Palestinians began to employ suicide bombings on a regular basis, the kill ratio began to be very much equal. So, it took about 1-1 or 1.3 to 1, it depends on how you run the numbers. So that's one reason why organizations do it, because it is effective compared to conventional methods. A second reason is it sends a potent psychological message to the enemy, in this case, the Israelis. It tells them that you are facing people who love death, who love the afterlife more than they love this life. You are fighting people who will not be deterred by threats of targeted assassinations and killings. And you are facing a people that is so determined to achieve their goal of liberation that they are willing to give up their lives. Now, the number one rule of counterterrorism is you increase the cost on terrorists, and hopefully that will deter them or at least contain them. And what we see is actually when you give up your life, what more cost do you want than that? So they see it as a powerful message, and I've been told that when if you kill, say, 9 Israelis, and forgive me, this sounds it's a depressing topic, but to say, when you kill 9 Israelis, say, with a conventional attack, the message is not as powerful as if you kill, say, 3 Israelis in a suicide attack. So even though you've killed less people, it is actually a more powerful message. Now, one thing to keep in mind, and the Palestinians have realized this, is after a while, Israelis get accustomed to this, and the potency of the psychological message gets lost. But the other thing, in any psychological warfare as this is, your target audience is not just the enemy. You have 2 others. You have the international community, whether it's the Europeans, the UN, the Americans, and also you have your internal audience. To the internal audience, it says that you have a people that are willing to fight, so you need to stand up. So it is a way to recruit people, or more accurately, it is a way to shame people, that you need to stand up so that the martyrs' lives don't go in vain. And for the international audience, it leads people to ask, what's going on over there that people are willing to kill themselves? Now notice none of these have to do with Islam or religion or religious faith or anything like that. These are purely tactical and strategic considerations in the context of an asymmetrical conflict. So I'll stop here about the organizations and let me shift gears towards the individual. If we try to adopt this rationalist view of cost-benefit calculations, we're facing a powerful enemy. If I do this, I'm only going to kill 2. If I do this, I'll kill 8. Let me go with option B. We'll never be able to understand the meaning of martyrdom for the suicide bombers, at least in the Palestinian case. In my research of suicide bombers, and the way I've done this is in light of the difficulty of interviewing suicide bombers, there are some colleagues of mine that have done excellent work in interviewing foiled suicide bombers. And so I cite some of that in my report, but being of my Arabic background, it's not as easy to go knock on Israeli prisons and say, I want to interview. I am going in a month, so hopefully they'll give me this opportunity now in light of de-escalations. Nonetheless, what I've done is I've read the communiques or the last will and testaments of the suicide bombers, which are usually issued immediately after an attack, but obviously they are written before the attack. And there are plenty of those, particularly Hamas does a very good job on their websites of issuing these, but also Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, Islamic Jihad, and others have written them. I've also looked at the videotape statements I was able to gather from prior to the attack. You know, the suicide bombers, what they do prior to the attack is they make a declaration and they call themselves the living martyrs. That is, the people who have made the commitment to die but are in the process of doing it. And they talk about some of the reasons. Now, to be sure, some of these things are imbued with propagandistic statements that can be that are inserted by the organizations themselves. So we should not just simply read these unproblematically. Nonetheless, if you read them carefully, you will hear the voice of the bombers in some instances. And what I focus on are statements that are directly to the families and statements that say things that no organization would think of. So for instance, one bomber tells his family, make sure to pay the debt that I owe to this person because, as you know, God will never accept any martyr in heaven if he has debts in this world. So that's one of the statements that you hear. Others, they urge their mothers and specifically their sisters to wear the hijab or to do the prayers, particularly the dawn prayers. So these are things that give a little bit of voice to the bombers. And what I found is that there are 3 themes in suicide bombings, or among the suicide bombers. The first theme is that this is an obligation imposed on us by God, or as an opportunity. Oftentimes it is phrased as an opportunity given to us by God. And that is, in Islam, and many of my Muslim friends hate to admit this, in Islam there are plenty of passages in the Quran that urge Muslims to fight injustice, to fight persecution, even if it means your own death, and that is the highest reward that you could possibly achieve. One of the narratives that I often hear in conversations with supporters of suicide bombers, and I did this at Al-Najah University in Nablus that has produced many suicide bombers, and most of them, by the way, come from engineering, I think one of them from medicine, one from Islamic law, Sharia, but most of them are engineers, either chemical engineers, civil engineers, etc., which scares me because my wife is a civil engineer from Jordan. With 2 kids, she might blow herself up, but none of this. Okay. One of the things that you hear is the narrative of how Islam developed in its earlier stages. And let me just give you a little bit of kind of a short history on how Islam emerged. When the Prophet Mohammed came to spread the monotheistic message in Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia today, around the year 610, indeed in the year 610, for the first 12 years, he faced tremendous amount of persecution, ridicule, rejection from the people of Mecca, and only a small community sort of gathered around him. But despite this, for the first 12 years, the Prophet Muhammad never urged direct fighting. And as a matter of fact, many of the Quranic passages say that even though you are facing persecution, it is better to be patient. It is, it's okay, endure. That is, it is better for the patient to do so. But after 12 years, when the Muslim community, because of the level of ridicule and persecution that they faced, had to immigrate from Mecca to Medina, which is also in Saudi Arabia today, the Muslims were given permission to fight. And that permission meant that the Muslims, which were a small community, the first battle was the Battle of Badr, the Muslims were able to gather about 314 people. And the people of Mecca, particularly the tribe of Quraysh, was able to gather at around 1,000 people, a little less than that. So they were outnumbered 3-1, and many Muslims were convinced that they were going to die. But the Quranic passages that come afterward, but certainly prior to that, trying to urge Muslims to fight, emphasize the idea that it is your obligation to fight injustice. When you see men and women being dispossessed of their homes, being thrown out of their areas, and just because they say our God is, or our Lord is God. So it is urging them to do so, but it also comes with a message that if you die, you will achieve tremendous amount of rewards. Your sins will be remitted immediately as soon as the first blood is shed. So as soon as the first drop falls out of your body, all your sins are wiped out. You will enter into the highest level of heaven, Jannat al-Firdaus. You will be able to intercede on the part of 70 family members. So, you go to God and say, God, cut them some slack. They haven't been that great of Muslims on earth, but nonetheless, they'll be, please let them in. There are other rewards. Most people in America and the West tend to focus on the 72 versions, which is, I assure you, when I interview people, this is the least of their concerns. It is not out of lust that they do this. But the one thing that they do cite most often is this notion of interceding on the part of their family members. So in the Battle of Badr, the first battle, the Muslims were outnumbered and they were facing certain death. Yet because of their determination, because of their strong faith, God allowed them to succeed. And in the first battle, they were able to turn away the people of Mecca. And it is even said in the Quranic passages that follow this battle that God showed his blessings on the Muslims, and he even sent angels to fight along their side. Now, one of the most cited passages, or one of the many passages cited in the statements of the suicide bombers, comes from this Battle of Badr, which I'm going to, let me go ahead and read real quickly, if I can find it. But basically it says, so you slew them not, but Allah slew them, and thou smotest not when thou didst smite the enemy. And it is said that the Prophet Muhammad picked up rocks and threw it in the faces of the invading armies, and he was able to at least repel some of them that way. And so this notion that you did not throw this, but God threw it, means that if you fight persecution, which is your obligation, it is an obligation that is imposed upon you. It is what's called a fard ayn, or an individual obligation. Because your land is being possessed, your country is being conquered, etc., it is your duty, but also you will achieve the rewards for doing that. So here's one of the statements of the bombers. His name is Ismail al-Mas'ubi. He writes, love for jihad and martyrdom has come to possess my life, my being, my feelings, my heart, and my senses. My heart ached when I heard the Quranic verses, and my soul was torn when I realized my shortcomings and the shortcomings of Muslims in fulfilling our duty in fighting in the path of God Almighty. Another one, Mahmoud Sulaiman Abu Hassanain, wrote, Dear Father, if I do not defend my religion, my land and holy sites, and another person does not, and another, then who will liberate the land and the holy places? So that's the first theme. The second theme of the discourse is the redemptive act of martyrdom. That is an ability to redeem your identity. You say you're a Muslim, but when the time comes to really show that you are truly a Muslim, are you going to cower, or are you really going to step up to the plate, so to speak? And indeed, many people frame their action as adhering to their identity and not shying away from it. One of the things that I found most interesting is that bombers on the day before their mission, or the day of their mission, when they're telling their families, I'm going to go, they're not supposed to tell their families because they don't want to be dissuaded. And in some instances, their families report on them just to get them, caught, because they'd rather have them than die. At least there were some instances where they've reported to the Palestinian Authority, at least, and there's at least one episode where they reported to the Israelis so as to prevent them. But what's interesting is a lot of the bombers refer to this as a test. So they tell their mothers, Mom, pray for me, I have a big test today. And the mother is thinking he's going to college, he has an exam. Or one person from Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade was walking, and he was, I think, 18 or so, or could be even younger. One of his friends, or the friend of his brother, said to him, "So when are you going to grow up?" He goes, "Well, today I'm going to find out if I'm a man or not." And people obviously don't know what he means until after the fact. Another person writes, a suicide bomber, his name is Fuad Ismail Mohammed al-Hawarmi. He writes, "Can there be men of truth if we are not willing to be men? A believer without courage is like a tree without fruit." By the way, this theme of adhering to your identity and not backing away in the face of difficulty is not just something that you find among suicide bombers, or at least Islamic suicide bombers. A lot of the kamikazes felt that, they didn't, when their brothers and others or their comrades did it, they didn't want to back away. But also American soldiers. American soldiers oftentimes say that, I go into battle, I fight, and you're willing to enter into a risky situation. You're doing it for your buddies because this is who you are, this is what you're trained to do. Again, firefighters going into buildings. High-risk activism. Granted, it's not guaranteed that they will die, but in some instances, it is very risky. And the third theme, of course, is reward in the afterlife. And again here, I want to emphasize that the reward is not necessarily the personal reward of the bomber himself, but the rewards to the family. That is the one that you hear over and over. So let me read you one or two from them. One of them, his name is Hamid Abu Hijla. He writes to his mom and to his family, "If I have fallen short in my duty toward you in this world, I will not fall short during Judgment Day, God willing. For know that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has said that the martyr intercedes with God on behalf of 70 of his family members." Another person, Shadi Sulaiman al-Nabahin, writes to his mother and father, "I wanted to beat you to heaven so I could intercede with my God on your behalf." So what this tells me is that when organizations adopt suicide bombings, even though they are doing it from strategic perspective, they try to make religious appeals, and they try to link their contemporary struggles with sacred history. In the case of Hamas and others, what they have done is they've tried to link their contemporary struggle in Palestine with the struggle of the Prophet Muhammad in earlier days, when the Muslims were weak, as the Palestinians are today, when they were outnumbered by superior armies, as the Muslims are, or as the Palestinians are today, and when they fought and were able to sacrifice, and in doing so they were able to succeed, and that's what they were hoping to do in the latest uprising. Let me stop my comments here, and I'll take your questions later. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Hafez. Professor Ebrahim Moosa.
Thank you, Professor Kish, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to participate here. I do not work on questions of terrorism. Sometimes I do moonlight. But my area of work is on understanding religion, Islamic law, and ethics in particular. And for reasons that you all know, post 9/11, everyone doing anything remotely close to the letter I gets drawn into these issues. That's how I got here today. So I'm not going to be able to talk to the things that Professor Kurzman and Professor Hafez has said. Only thing is that, some of the the good thing about sociology is that it says things are wrong, but you can still go on with it. And so the whole question of the causes of terrorism and the reasons for its emergence. Obviously, Professor Kurzman has pointed out the various kind of hierarchy of possibilities and what it is. Some people point out post-colonial blues, etc. But one of the things that I seem to focus on is the question of what is happening within Muslim societies. And the whole question of people having different visions for the future. And different kinds of narratives of explanation of what is happening right now, what is happening to their societies. Because in large part, while the conflict is between people who openly identify with an Islamic narrative, and in this instance right now with Euro-America, with America first as the major target, the question is also the internal debates within Islam. And so some of you might have read the weekend press. There was a piece in the Sunday Times magazine that, you know, terrorism is a middle class factor. It was pointed out by Professor Kurzman. The question of loss of prestige, but also part of the larger debate that I seem to get from reading Arabic newspapers, watching Al Jazeera, that wonderful source of information. Do not believe the State Department and anybody else when they tell you that it's a propagandistic arm. It is a great source of information, and you can learn a great deal about it. I do not know. But there's a great book out. 2 weeks ago, Isabel Hilton, or 3 weeks ago, reviewed it in a New York Times magazine, in the book review section by a British author. Throws a complete different light on Al Jazeera. In fact, we may not make so many mistakes if we just watch Al Jazeera. But the question is that the fact that Muslim elites are mortgaging their lives and engaging in acts of suicide, and they're doing so because they believe that some of the leadership in various countries in the question of repressive regimes are also leasing and mortgaging their future interest to imperial and colonial powers, is part of a very, very strong, visceral feeling that you find when you go into the streets of Cairo or Pakistan, even New Delhi or other places. I travel around extensively, and the way I look, and given my name, I can almost, just blend in and just hear. And I know Charlie will say that is not scientific. It is not scientific. It is better than scientific. Now, the big question is that the horse of religion has bolted. I mean, and this is my theme. The horse of religion has bolted from the constraints of tradition. That is one of the big issues that I think that is happening in the Muslim world. In other words, Islamdom has an oversupply of Luthers. There's a huge oversupply of Luthers. I mean, I don't know why people post 9/11 are saying Islam needs a Luther. We've been having Luthers for the last 200 years. Each one comes with a different recipe. And these recipes have now become toxic in some ways. Now, part of the problem is that the absence of, and what I would call the atrophy of traditional Islam, has resulted in skewed religion in Muslim societies, and that is exacerbated by social anomie. And here, people like Charlie and Professor Hafez and others would throw much more greater light of what is the social anomie, governance being a major problem. Now, in this context where you have an absence of tradition, religion becomes essentialized, and religion is a thing. Whereas before it was much more layered and much more complex and built into cultural practices and cultural traditions. So, in some way, what has been happening for the last 100 years in various parts of the Muslim world is what I would call the Protestantization of Islam. That Islam has become Protestant. It's about a text, and increasingly about a text. Let me just throw some light. In the 19th century, when thinkers like Jamaluddin al-Afghani and his disciple Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida in Egypt, or people like Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan in India, who founded Aligarh Muslim University, a number of Muslim reformers in different parts of the world were trying to engage with the rise of Europe, European power, colonialism, and how do Muslims get themselves out of this problem. Their analysis was that the problem in the Muslim world is that we have a clerisy, the ulama, and many of these people came from ulama background, Afghani, Abdu, Rashid Reza, they themselves were from the ulama background. That the ulama have become fossilized in their thinking, and the ulama are not updating tradition, and the biggest problem in Muslim society is that the ulama are advocating adherence, blind adherence to their teachings, whereas in fact those teachings have become outdated, and they advocated that ijtihad, the notion that Muslims must engage in intellectual effort and rethink questions of religion and law and ethics in particular, but also ijtihad much more broadly in cultural terms must take place, and every Muslim is authorized to read the Quran and make his or her interpretation. In other words, they push people away from the traditional forms of authority to kind of individual forms of authority. Now, they had good reason to do so because the ulama themselves, in various parts of the Muslim world, did become fairly insular. And part of it was that with the in the case of India, I can speak much more better than elsewhere, is that in the case of in India, the ulama, when they failed to resist British colonialism militarily, and the collapse of the Mughals' power in earlier centuries, but in the middle of the 19th century, the ulama began to realize that it may be best to create fortress Islam within teaching institutions, within the madrasas. And don't believe a word that Thomas Friedman tells you about madrasas. He's never been there. He speaks to people outside the streets of Karachi, and he makes authoritative statements, very muscular and very misleading statements. I mean, madrasas are much more complex things than the things that you read in the press. And I've got a book that I'm working on inside the madrasas that will come out in about 2 years' time. The question is that so in India, the ulama built the madrasas in order to preserve tradition. And tradition had to become, or was required to become, a kind of bulwark against modernity. Because modernity comes to the Muslim world on the back of colonialism. So colonialism is resisted, and modernity should be resisted. There are other Muslims who do engage with modernity, so Sayyid Ahmad Khan being one of them. In other parts of the Muslim world, like in the Arab Middle East, modernity does seep into the religious traditions too. So for instance, Al-Azhar in Egypt, the largest and the most important, at least in the North African context, traditional religious institution, through a series of reforms, and especially under Gamal Abdel Nasser, for instance, had become extremely modernized in a variety of ways, through curricula, as well as it has broadened its range of offerings to medical school, studies in veterinary sciences, etc., and also the social sciences and humanities. In India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, the madrasas do not go for that range of offerings. It's a very, very closely knit tradition of studying classical texts in order to preserve the historical Islamic scholastic tradition. So madrasas and madrasas differ from place to place. Now, that development of putting Muslims into contact with the tradition in a form of autodidactic fashion becomes heightened by the rise of social movements, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that becomes a pan-Islamic movement, the rise of the Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, that becomes a very important a network of social movements in the Indian subcontinent. But this also becomes global. So the Jamaat Islami and Muslim Brotherhood, when students come to the United States, establish networks here in North America as well as in Europe. And those social movements have a much more stronger engagement with modernity. And in that way, this version, what I would call, for the lack of a better word, Protestant version of Islam and modernity speak to each other much more intensely. In other words, the discourse of religion is strongly inflected with the discourse of science in particular. Because many of the people who come to study are engineers and engineers and engineers. I mean, these are the three major professions you find amongst modern middle-class Muslims: engineers, engineers, and engineers. And some of them are dentists and medical sciences. But they begin to see the religious tradition in this kind of scientific mode. So the text is now read, the revealed text, the prophetic authority is now read as a political manual, or is read as a scientific text, or it is read as an engineering manual, or the solutions that are derived from these very scientific readings are very much at odds with the way in which the ulama practice religion. The ulama follow a very, very complicated tradition of understanding that human beings interpret the tradition and every generation. And so when you want to know what is the answer to, say, organ transplantation or brain death, etc., you don't go and read the Quran. You don't go and dig in the Sunnah. You look at the canonized opinions that have been handed down through a very, very complicated practice of law and ethics and theology. So you have extensive literature on these topics, etc. But what has happened is that this rise of Protestant version of Islam has in some ways also infected, excuse me, I'm trying to nurse a cold, so I've got all kinds of stuff coming down. This relationship between, as I said, this kind of modernized version of Islam, or Protestant version of Islam, what people call Salafi version, it does have also a genealogy, a line into historical Islam. So oftentimes those people who are practicing this version of a text-centered Islam, following the Quran and the Sunnah alone, that is the prophetic tradition, do have a genealogy, what people call Salafi or Wahhabi, okay? And I think most of you people are now familiar with that, and even the New York Times quotes Ibn Taymiyyah, in David Brooks' columns. It's fantastic. I mean, I don't know what's happening in this country. It's a real, so we'll be in business for the next 100 years, Charlie. So the thing is that this question of this Protestant version of Islam also now begins to affect the ulama's tradition. And the ulama realize that this version of Islam has reach. They use media, they use technology, use variety of electronic media. So the ulama are also slowly and gradually abandoning their complex traditions. And you see that particularly in the Arab Middle East. In the Arab Middle East. In India and Pakistan, the ulama are still holding out, but just. And in Iran, the ulama are holding out, but though, in fact, in Iran, the ulama have taken power. So there are a number of trends amongst the ulama themselves, those who are gravitating more towards a kind of modernist thinking, those who are holding out more to traditions, or those who are trying to hold modernity and tradition in some kind of productive tension. Now, part of the problem here has been that in the broadest spheres of Muslim society, the rise of modern education, secular education, also in some way marginalizes the Islamic past, and that people do not know of their sense of belonging and what the historical past. And someone like Edward Said, that many of you know, who is an Arab, Christian Arab, Palestinian, he would say that when he grew up and was educated in Cairo, and mostly in Cairo, he knew more about all the British lords and British colonial authorities that he knew about his own historical culture. And oftentimes people know more about Newton than they know about Tusi. They know more about Durkheim than they know Ibn Khaldun. And there is a sense of alienation that happens that later on kicks in when people begin to realize that, who are we? So the Islamic revivalists have obviously at the moment holding the stage in very many places of the Muslim world. Now, what that results in is that you have a very, very powerful rhetor and rhetorical authority to be able to mobilize people when you speak straight from the Quranic text. That becomes a kind of unmediated authority. And therefore, you do see the phenomena of suicide bombing, for instance, more often in those regions where you have a particular brand of Islam prevalent. Either the revivalist version of Islam that you have within Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine, or you would have the versions of a kind of a hybrid between the revivalist and ulama Islam in parts of Iraq and also Egypt and North Africa. So that kind of hybridity. In fact, I haven't done the investigation and the research yet, but I doubt that under the Taliban there were ever suicide bombings. And even now that the Taliban, for instance, are giving resistance right now I'm not entirely sure whether there is suicide bombing is a technique. Wow. So so part of the problem is that and here is the dilemma for the young Muslim. That is, there's very few places that you have a living tradition. And if you have to go to the living tradition, you have to go to the ulama. The ulama have a paraphernalia, have a different kind of performance that does look antiquarian. Long beards, particular ways of wearing clothes, etc. That the young modern Muslim cannot gravitate towards that. There's a kind of a barrier. The ulama are also not doing anything to update the tradition to talk to younger people, except when they talk in a very different language. So people do gravitate to the revivalist version of Islam that sounds rational, scientific, and also very, very powerful, and it can also inflect political power. So when people follow this revivalist version of Islam, they seek tradition in text. Sometimes when I'm in a bad mood, I call it dead text society. Dead poet society, dead text society. But that's when I'm in a bad mood. And when they do this kind of embrace, they also embrace it with all the complexity of the traditions of modernity. And so you have historical texts written in a particular kind of genre, then given a particular kind of inflection with the modern mediology and the way it is mediated. Let me just say a couple of other things. In the absence of proper authority structures, combined and compounded by political repression, religious fervor becomes the vehicle for the expression of political dissent, and we've seen it elsewhere. The classical example is Ayman al-Zawahiri. Ayman al-Zawahiri, I don't know how many of you know, who's Bin Laden's right-hand person. This guy comes from a very, very distinguished Egyptian family in terms of pedigree. If you compare him and Mubarak would not even end up in the kitchen of their family. That's a status question, okay? And this guy was a physician, moderately interested in Islam at the time when Sadat gets assassinated. There's a huge swoop, and tens of hundreds of people get arrested, anybody remotely interested, and this guy gets tortured. I don't know how many of you have seen documentaries or pictures that Sadat's alleged murderers are put in those cages and they're brought into the courtrooms. The one person who is speaking with the Quran in the hands and speaks English in an Egyptian accent that says, "Who are we? We are Muslims. They are doing this to us." He's very, very outraged. That is Ayman al-Zawahiri. He was made in the torture chambers of Mubarak. He was produced there. And many of the narratives and micro stories that come out of this political repressive environment. And the primary targets, in my view, are indigenous regimes. But since Euro-American powers have tied their national security interests to these indigenous repressive regimes, they are viewed as partners in crime and possibly are viewed as the cause for people's domestic miseries. So in some ways, 9/11 is where the politics and the oil fields of Saudi Arabia coalesce in New York. Former alliances are coming apart between Al-Qaeda, before it was called Al-Qaeda officially, but its alliances with U.S. intelligence, military agencies in Afghanistan. And the one person that should still speak out is Brzezinski. Brzezinski was the major architect of this. And there's a reason why he's a dove in this whole Iraq operation, because he knows the terrain fairly well. So my description is, or my analysis is that terrorism is the product of an encounter with the political. In that confrontation, everything from culture, science, religion, and art become utilized or become, in some ways, the victims. But terrorism, it should be clear from my presentation thus far, is a product of an encounter with the state and its uses of modern technological power to achieve its ends. And lastly, if I can just have a half a minute, Madam Chair, and that is that what is emerging in these wars on terror, I believe that the wars on terror is an impossible thing to do. In fact, I'm talking to people in of former people in government, former ambassadors, and a whole range of people at NYU, who are looking for alternative ways to get out of this quagmire of wars and terror. And there's a public policy group there at NYU. And because in some ways what one sees in terrorism is that non-state actors are mimicking state actors in a demonstration of power. And we are in a society of the spectacle. The spectacle is all about it. And, you know, as a Cameroonian scholar, Achille Mbembe, says in his instructive essay called Necropolitics, published in Political Culture, he shows that modern wars have resorted to the nomadic practices of hit and run rather than conquer and annex the type of territorial wars to which we have become accustomed. It is an age where B-52 stealth bombers silently wreak their destruction on civilian population. And it's interesting, the counterfigure of the B-52 bomber is the suicide bomber. That is the counterfigure. Stealthily and anonymously joining the crowds and then suddenly and dramatically sows his or her destruction. So tragic as it is, and we have had very complex analysis of this, but suicide bombers in asymmetrical conditions are the poor man's version of the B-52 bomber. The B-52 is also the tragic use of human invention and human technology in other ways. So two types of bodies, fuselage and torso, metal and flesh, are the overarching poetics of this war on terror. In the one, height and distance from the target is the tactic of ambush. In the other, it is the intimacy and proximity, if not the anonymity, of the candidate for suicide, which becomes the tactic of ambush. The B-52 bomber and the pilot only sees the strobes on his cockpit, unable to behold the death and destruction that he sows. And the suicide bomber just doesn't see it. The one is hailed as a martyr and promised eternal salvation. The other gets high fives because he comes back alive and gets promotion and gets medals for bravery. And depending on which side you stand, there are two vocabularies. You kill and others become sacrifice, and you make a sacrifice for your country or for your religion. So what terrorism definitely shows, and clearly shows to me, is that shock and awe practices of warfare are not the preserve of the powerful alone. It was short-sighted to think that shock and awe of 2.1 million tons of bombs thrown over Laos, or the shock and awe intended behind Hiroshima, could not be repeated. And I think that is a very, very critical issue. And terrorism lays bare the meaning and practice of politics. It is about human beings, flesh and blood. And as long as we keep on seeing politics as game theory, or we see it as statistics and numbers and electoral ballot boxes, etc., the biopolitics are going to come right into our faces. Actually, this morning, as I was getting ready to come here, my wife said that somewhere in New York, 2 Muslim women were apprehended. I didn't get the full story, but it sounded quite ominous. So what it is that, you know, we are facing a situation where the biopolitics, life politics, the bare politicization of life, which is part of our reality, is becoming much more visceral and gruesome. And I think the language of political realism, the priority of national security interests, economic interests, game theories, and the niceties of international law, in addition to dozens of other justificatory languages, make us forget that the political is, after all, about human beings. And if human beings, all human beings, those of friend and enemy, are not going to be the primary concern in interstate and international politics, then we are in this for a long haul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Moosa. Our panelists have given us a great deal to chew on. And we have, I believe, about 20 minutes, 15?
About 15.
15
and
minutes.
Again, a reminder, we have 2 young ladies with microphones, so if you have a comment or a question, please raise your hand, wait for them to bring you the microphone.
And please do tell us who you are. We have a gentleman in the back row in the middle.
Thank you. Jeff Holsgrove, Duke University. In the Christian just war tradition, it's absolutely prohibited to deliberately target civilians. We heard a lot from the panel today about what motivates Muslims to, or some Muslims to use violence against imaginary or real oppression, but could the panel say something about this distinction between deliberately targeting civilians and in the Muslim world? Thank you.
It's interesting you asked that. I'm working on a paper called Moral Disengagement in Suicide Bombings, and basically the idea is it's one thing to explain suicide bombings, but another to explain why they target civilians. In the case of Sri Lanka, for instance, the Tamil Tigers rarely target civilians, but in Al-Qaeda and Hamas and others have done so. There are various discursive practices to be able to justify targeting civilians. One of them is to deny the notion that there are civilians. So in the case of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, what Hamas, both at the level of the bombers and the organizers, say is that Israeli society is a militarized society. It is an army with a state as opposed to a state with an army. The fact that most Israelis are conscripted into the military at the age of 18, most of them have reserve duty after they've done their basic conscription. All that means that they are all military people that are legitimate targets. Now, whether this is, you accept that interpretation or not, that's one way to do it. In some instances, they point to Quranic passages where they say, there's one that says, if you are punished in the way that they punish you. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, something to that effect. What they neglect to mention is the next passage, which says, but if you are patient, it is better for the patient. But nonetheless, they point that, and in my interviews with Hamas supporters, I specifically asked that. How could you target civilians when there are in Islam strict prohibitions? There's a famous story about the Prophet Mohammed coming across a woman who had been slain, and he says this woman would not have been fighting, and he sent after his general, I think Khalid ibn Walid, and told him not to kill women and children and serfs, basically people that don't fight. Well, their response was to cite that passage. If you are punished, you punish in the same way that they punish you until they stop. Once they stop, you do that. And Al-Qaeda actually says that and bin Laden says that in an interview. He says, as long as Americans continue to kill our civilians, it is permissible for us to do so in self-defense until they stop. So it is kind of there's that limitation on their moral outrage, if you will. So I'll stop here.
I just have two comments. One is that traditionalist authorities in Muslim societies would place restraints on the killing of civilians in particular, deliberately targeting them. And however, some traditional authorities have moved away from that position, especially Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the cleric in Qatar, Egyptian cleric. I mean, one of the things that the media says a lot of things about Qaradawi. I mean, Qaradawi in the 70s was a kind of a breath of fresh air, kind of a liberal traditionalist. He was very widely acclaimed, traveled to the United States very often, etc. But it seems he's taken a much more, and looks at the Iraq and Palestinian situation much more gravely. So he has moved his position and he authorizes, or in some ways legitimates, the position of suicide bombing in the Palestinian context. Ironically, he also gave the fatwa for the U.S. Marines, not Marines, but the Army, that it was permissible for Muslims to serve in the American Army in the war against Afghanistan, in Afghanistan. He saw that as a violation, the attack on 9/11. So Qaradawi looks at issues in much more complex ways. It is not necessarily anti-American, as many people make fun of. People like bin Laden and others take a much more constructivist position on the question of ethics. And so, in other words, they would take into account the whole question of the political stakes, as Professor Hafez has just pointed out. So that's where the end lies, the constructivist position, where the political ends become more important. Third, and the other point I want to make is the question of, can the technologies that we have of warfare, that when you throw a 10,000-pound bomb, and your intention is to hit at that military installation, there is no guarantee that even in all this pinpoint bombing, that you will not injure civilians or people who are there. So the question of intent, I think in modern warfare, becomes somewhat superfluous, given the nature of the technology. And so oftentimes in ethics, the question is about intent, right? I mean, what is the intent? And deliberately attacking civilians in the historical just war theories of ethics. But the question I keep on raising is that in the modern context, can that be upheld by all sides? And I think once we have some discussion about that, the positions might be different.
I'd like to, could I just, as I understand it, that in the Western tradition, just war theories have often been in tension with pragmatism, and the idea that we need to do whatever we need to do. And so the debates around, for example, the dropping of atomic bombs on Japan, targeting civilians, the idea was, well, this will save a certain number of lives, and therefore the calculation makes it worth it. This kind of pragmatic balancing utilitarianism has always been in tension with the idea that there are limits on what one could be allowed to do in war. There is a parallel debate within the Islamic context, of course, not citing Augustine or something, but a whole set of other classic sources and traditions. And I just want to point out, which hasn't been pointed out yet, that that bin Laden's, or the acts of 9/11, the attacks of 9/11 were roundly condemned as being outside of the Islamic tradition of just war, by virtually every Islamic leader in the world, from the Sheikh al-Azhar to Yusuf al-Qaradawi to Iranian leaders across the political spectrum there. And I've collected a huge number of these statements against terrorism, and particularly condemning 9/11 by prominent Muslim scholars on my webpage. If you look for Islamic denunciations or statements against terrorism or something like that, it should come up from my homepage.
Thank you.
Gil Merckx, Department of Sociology, Duke University. I have a question for Professor Mohammed Hafez. When you discussed three levels of factors involved in terrorism: the motives of the bomber, the suicide bomber, the motives of the organization's strategic calculus they make, but you had a third level in society. And it wasn't clear to me. You went through that really quickly, and I wonder if you could talk about the societal factors that interact with organizational and individual factors.
I went through it so quickly that I didn't even talk about it. Basically, what I mentioned up front is I'll talk about the first two and leave the third for the sake of time. But basically, what I argue in the Palestinian case, at least, that one cannot just simply explain this phenomena by looking at organizations saying, hey, this is good, this is something that could serve our cause, and individuals willing to do it. If the state acted, in this case, Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority acted, as they have done in the past, to stop it, both in terms of physical actions of policing, what we would call repression, or in terms of publicly denouncing it and drawing red lines, as he has done in the past, this thing would not have extended beyond that. But it would be a mistake to just simply say that it's legitimating authority by the state. You had the whole Arab media, Al Jazeera being a prominent one, and most Palestinians, if you go in the West Bank and Gaza, even in the poorest areas, have these huge satellite dishes on their thing, and where they watch Al Jazeera and do so religiously. Al Jazeera, which featured Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who people watch on a weekly basis. He has this program called the Sharia wal Haya, Islamic Law and Life, and he basically says this is okay. People of Al-Azhar, sometimes vacillating, but generally say it's okay. You had Islamic scholars all over the world saying that this action is okay. And by doing so, that is the Hamas actions, not in general suicide bombings. And in doing so, you have people like Khalid Mish'al of Hamas saying, hey, look, the Islamic scholars agree that this is martyrdom, that this is permissible. And I think legitimating authority empowered those organizations to do so. But there's the Israeli factor. The Israeli reaction to the first 3 months, and we could say the first 6 months of the uprising, was brutal. In the first 3 months, about 300 Palestinians were killed when only about 2 or 3 Israelis were killed. And in that sense, it shows you that the Palestinians were overwhelmed by their repression. And the Israelis admit that their strategy all along was to overwhelm the Palestinians so that they achieve escalation dominance, which actually failed. They ended up leading to a backlash. And that experience of the Israelis stemmed from their earlier fighting that took place in 96 or 97, when Netanyahu opened a tunnel and the Palestinians fired guns, and you had Israelis lose lives. So all along since then, generals usually fight the last battle. they prepared that if the next time this happens, we would use overwhelming force. Well, when they did that, that really polarized the conflict, and it made people feel like that they needed just retribution, and the suicide bombers presented that.
Thank you. We have a gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Argo Budiari. I'm from the Embassy of Indonesia. And first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for their extensive and detailed explanations, and it certainly enlightened me. May I ask Professor Kurzman of a question that, and if we talk about the act of terrorism against the United States or the West, is there a study that you endeavored that you can find a single common cause of it? Is it poverty or the lack of economic opportunity that they do not have, or is it ideological reasons behind it, or simply they just hate the United States, which I don't believe. In one of the things that I read in newspapers is in one of the interrogation towards a terrorist in the frontline state, I don't know whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq, he said that in his act of terrorism against the United States is not because he hates the United States, because of the policies of the United States. And for example, he mentioned about the one-sided policy against the Palestinians and too pro-Israel. Just your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I guess I don't believe we will ever come up with a single cause. And there's a couple reasons. One may be that there is no single cause, that there are a variety of factors that will interact to produce acts of violence. The second is more perhaps cynical, which is that the debate over causes cannot end because social scientists would be out of a job if it ended. That everybody has to prove themselves by criticizing earlier explanations and coming up with their own. And there's this sort of Oedipal generational conflict that is sort of a full employment act for us social scientists. So I don't believe that there will ever be a single explanation. If we wanted to wait for that, we would be waiting forever. It would be futile. However, you mentioned a particular cause, whether it's just hatred of the West, and I don't think that is the cause, as you suggest. I don't think that there's a generalized hatred of the West. Many people who are most hostile to the United States policies and the United States government are active consumers of many aspects of United States culture, cultural industries. I was struck, for example, by hearing young Iranians several years ago denounce the United States and its embargo against Iran, at the same time as they would then finish their political diatribe and ask me if I knew about the latest Hollywood action films that they had received pirated DVDs of. And I think this mixture is there, that the hatred that we see is not really the right question. Also, if on surveys and in conversations, just as I'm sure you know, people can express virulent hatred of United States government and policies, at the same time not doing anything about it. There's something else involved in taking actual steps to do something about it. The old joke about everybody complains about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. It's sort of similar here too. The United States policies are sort of like the weather. They come from outside, they're inexplicable, you never know, you never have much advance warning, and frankly, nobody's doing anything about it.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, good morning, Mike.
Terrorism as a facet of asymmetric warfare is more generally accepted in Middle Eastern and Far Eastern cultures. Are we doing a disservice in trying to solve this dilemma through the eyes of Westphalia and Clausewitz? Do we really need to shift our paradigm? Because I really haven't seen that a lot in current debate.
Is this to a specific person or in general?
Please open to anyone.
You're the political scientist. I would suggest that asymmetric warfare is challenging the assumptions of war making and international conflict that have underpinned policy and academic debates for the past half century, and in particular the rise of non-state actors. What you have is freelance warriors. These are not people who are involved in a state apparatus. They don't have the command and control structures that we're used to. And in effect, they are small units, militias, if you will, making war on their own. And it's extremely difficult to incorporate non-state actors into the state-based models. I think that what is happening slowly is that these models are trying to learn from other literatures and other types of experience. And those would be the experience of insurgencies, rebellions, where it's not in state challengers against a state, the experience of criminal networks and immigration flows and these sorts of networks of organizations that cross state boundaries and are sometimes quite autonomous actors from state control. And that as we try to incorporate these non-state actors into the models, I don't think we're in the early days of this, and I don't think we know where this is heading. My sense is that the kinds of correlates of war that the political scientists have been looking at for some decades now are going to fall by the wayside, because you simply don't need the level of resources to sustain these battles. Your GDP per capita doesn't matter so much as, for example, the access of a small number of people to a particular military technology or strategy. So my guess is that everything is going to be thrown up for grabs, and it may call into question the very act of predicting or explaining, as retroactively predicting, these types of outbursts. But that's my pessimistic view. Perhaps others are more optimistic.
Just a quick comment on that. A very good question. I think the war metaphor may have been useful, but it's outdone its usefulness. What you're dealing with are complex problems that cannot be dealt with and this sounds hackneyed, but it cannot be dealt with in a warlike manner. We could get rid of the Taliban, we could dismantle the Al-Qaeda network and disrupt it, but when the underlying culture of martyrdom, if you will, the underlying grievances that are driving people towards, or some people, even a minuscule people, to that action have to be dealt with.